We can start.
Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome back to the Ouroboros seminar. After a short hiatus, a short pause, we're starting with the second half of the Ouroboros seminar series, where we investigate and discuss various aspects of the exciting, multifaceted legacy of Francisco Varela. As you probably know, my name is Sebastjan. I'm the host or the moderator of these meetings. In general, the meetings are, as you probably know, organized jointly by the research group Metanoia, the Mind and Life Europe Institute, and the Faculty of Arts, University of Ljubljana. The seminar is part of a broader initiative of Mind and Life Europe, which is centered around two anniversaries, namely the 20th anniversary of Francisco Varela's passing, which occurred in 2001, and the 30th anniversary of the publication of The Embodied Mind, which was published in 1991. Now, before we move on to today's seminar, I would kindly ask Gabor Karsai, the Managing Director of Mind and Life Europe, to say a few words about the upcoming events or any news with regards to happenings in the context of Mind and Life Europe.
Thank you, Sebastjan. Thank you all for participating and listening to this talk today. I will be short as we have more important and informative content to listen to today. But I would like to share the good news that we are also going to continue the Francisco and Friends webinar series this fall. We had two events, one with the Dalai Lama and one with Evan Thompson in June this year. And we are going to have John Kabat-Zinn on September 9th, next Thursday at 6 p.m. Central Europe time, and Roger John Halifax on September 23rd, again 6 p.m. Central Europe time, to share their experiences working and being friends with Francisco. We are very much looking forward to those two special occasions besides the Ouroboros seminars this month. Thank you, Sebastjan.
Thank you very much, Gabor. Looking forward to these events. Now on to the Ouroboros seminar. So as I've mentioned, we've entered the second part or the second half of the seminar, which will last till, I think, December 1st. As you probably know by now, the events are, or the meetings happen every first and third week in each month. The general structure of the seminars is as follows. So we have approximately 40-minute long presentation of one or two papers usually. This is followed by a 60 to 90-minute long discussion. And during this discussion, the participants can pose questions. They can do so via chat, both here on Zoom or on YouTube. When you're posing your question, you can, of course, notify me if you would like me to read the question. If not, and we prefer this, the participants themselves can pose the question. I would kindly ask you to try to formulate your questions as clear and cogent as possible, if possible, of course. And again, a call out to younger generations to speak up and voice their questions and views and opinions. Also, a brief reminder, you can find also all relevant information on the Mind and Life Europe website and the Metanoia website. You can also find most of the important things or events that are coming up on Twitter. And also there's a Discord page, which has I think it's currently in a bit of a slumber, but maybe we can shake it up and wake it up in the upcoming weeks or months. So our today's guest is Antoine Lutz. Before I hand over the word to Antoine, I would just like to briefly introduce today's presenter. Dr. Antoine Lutz is currently a director of research at the French Medical Research Institute in the Lyon Neuroscience Research Center, where he co-leads the experiential neuroscience and mental training team. After a master's degree in engineering and a BA in philosophy at Sorbonne under the direction of Nathalie Desprats, he did his PhD in cognitive neuroscience in Paris, France, with Francisco Varela, where he applied for the first time his neurophenomenology program to study the neural correlates of attention and perception. Since 1998, he has studied meditation with various teachers, including Migyu Rinpoche, Tsongki Rinpoche, Mathieu Ricard, and Joseph Goldstein. His current research group focuses on the neurophenomenology of mindfulness and compassion meditations, and on the impact of these practices on consciousness, attention, and emotion regulations and pain perception. This research is currently funded by European ERC Consolidator Grant, and he's also currently collaborating with a European research consortium investigating the impacts of meditation practices on aging and well-being as measured by brain imaging, biomarkers of aging, and psychoaffective and cognitive behavioral measures. He recently started a collaboration investigating the neurocomputational principles of meditation. Now, the paper that we will be talking about today, that Andreas will be presenting, is a very well-known paper, a paper that has acquired almost a cult-like status in some circles. It's, of course, a 1996 paper called Neurophenomenology, and Antoine, of course, is a very, very fitting candidate for presenting this particular paper. Now, Antoine, maybe I would kindly ask you, before you plunge into the very texture of this interesting paper, to maybe share a few words or thoughts about reminiscences about your experiences with Francisco Varela. So, you know, how you got to know him, what was your relationship like, what got you intrigued in his work, and so on and so forth. So, Antoine, I now give the word to you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to this Ouroboros seminar, and I'm really thrilled to be presenting, discussing with you today this very seminal paper from Francisco. Actually, that was one of this paper in particular, and his paper on time consciousness, what really led me to apply to his PhD position with Francisco. So when I was just attending his master program, I heard him presenting his view on neurophenomenology, and I was really moved by the I think the ambition and the power of the framework, and what resonated with me a lot, that it was really a genuine attempt to be able to do science while also combining and keeping at the same time all the richness of human experience. And that's really what was very appealing to me. And I guess it's because also, as a neuroscientist, sometimes it was hard to know really where to fit some aspect of human experience. You know, just the feeling of the feeling of being a person, the ipseity and so on. Always the hard question: where does it fit in matter and the universe? So I think I was very moved by and quite fascinated by the clarity of his vision, and even if it required sometimes to get into the framework. And for the little story, I was supposed to work on time consciousness and with him. And when we wrote a research proposal for my PhD, and the day I was supposed to submit it, apparently someone in the lab was also working on time, and she decided that it was not appropriate that I work on time. So we changed everything, and Francisco was amazing. And I said, okay. And then we move into space. So we work on perception of space, and it was also a great topics. But it was a fun story. Voila. And what to say? Yeah, I mean, it's really nice to. I found it very nice to have the opportunity to reread again this paper and some of his work, because I even if there's been a lot of research since over the last 20 years, I always found that there is something very still very modern and radical in the framework, and I think it still need to be. There's still something to teach, I think, maybe for the new generation, and so I will do my best to present it in front of eminent scholars such as, like, I see Evan, I see Natalie, so I will do my best to fit with their standards. Also, so I'm going to start. Can you see my screen?
No, so far.
No. Okay, let me start to do that part.
Okay.
Alors, can you give me the right, because I was disconnected. Would you mind letting me be host again?
Just give me a second.
Unpredictable predictables kick in.
Yes. So I'm okay. So as a, let's see. We've done it before, but it's all right. I hope it's the right one. Okay.
Okay.
Do you see my notes?
Yeah, no, we don't see the notes. It's the correct one.
Correct. Okay. So I always like this picture, and I was here when it was taken by Franz, who was doing a movie on Francisco, and I was actually working on some of the data and at the apartment, and so it was always nice. I remember when this picture was taken, and it brings a lot of good memory. So I'm going to start to say, ask, okay, neurophenomenology, its origin. There's some nice cool tool now on Google when you can enter a term and look at its the frequency of occurrences in books. So when you enter neurophenomenology, you get this curve. I've done it last night, and you see that before 1996, there was actually this term was already used in books, and so as you probably know, Francisco did not coin the term. It was introduced by the first author was Charles Lothing Manus and Dakili in a book called Brain Symbol: An Experience Toward a Neurophenomenology of Human Consciousness. Having said that, I think Francisco used this term and he explained it in a very funny footnotes in the article that he would have preferred to call it a neuropsycho-evolutionary phenomenology, but recognized that it would have been unduly cumbersome. So he used the term neurophenomenology, and I think I suspect that part of the curve that is following 1996 comes from his use of the term neurophenomenology. Now, oops, problem. Oh, okay. So what's the status of neurophenomenology in a science now as a concept? So good news, it's not dead. So I did also last night, you enter neurophenomenology in PubMed and you get that amount of publications since 2002. And you can see that there's still it's quite vivid. It's several publications every year, and so that it's a concept that's still used and probably with different meanings, but it's a concept that is has some traction in the field also. Now, what was the general context of the paper? So Francisco wrote it in 1996, and he proposed a program of neurophenomenology as a research direction, as a pragmatic response, as he said, to the heart problem. And he used the term neurophenomenology to refer to, quote, the quest to marry modern cognitive science and a disciplined approach to human experience. So the big emphasis of the paper was its methodological point. And so he presents this paper in relation to the debate, which was at the time introduced by Joseph Levine, called the explanatory gap, and it produced a lot of reply in books, in particular by, for instance, someone like John Searle or David Chalmers, who coined at the time also the hard problem of consciousness. And Francisco specifically wrote this article in reply to Chalmers' proposal of to add an extra ingredient to solve the hard problem of consciousness. And his proposal to add an extra ontology to solve the hard problem of consciousness. So, as you probably all know, this debate, just to briefly summarize, consciousness experience can be characterized in two ways. So with third-person data, so essentially any kind of objective measures. That's, for instance, neural activity when you or any kind of biophysical measures. And but as Joseph Levine wrote in his seminal paper in 1983, when you describe something like pain and saying that it is a firing of a C fiber, it might be very useful that it has some truth and it's valid in a physical way, but it doesn't really help us to understand what it is to experience pain as a qualitative experience, a subjective experience. So the question is a relationship between all these objective measures, essentially the law of physics, physiology, neuroscience, and so on. What's the relationship with what it is to be a person, an agent, an organism experiencing pain or perceiving a visual object and so on. And so the central issue is to understand how to relate these two types of data. And so for Francisco, what was at stake is to be able to account for a scientific theory that could really explicitly account for what it is to be a subject, and in a way that would be meaningful and that could really incorporate the phenomenology of the person. So there are three. I'm going to go kind of step by step, reviewing the different section of this manuscript, of this paper. In the first one, Francisco offered a cartography of approaches to in response to this explanatory gap of consciousness. And so, okay. Oh, okay. Well, I got somehow. Oh no, doesn't matter. Well, I deleted a slide, but that's okay. So in terms of the reductionist aspect, it's Francisco was in a nutshell his main argument that there was an irreducible dimension to consciousness. So that was expressed by many philosophers like John Searle at the time, and say that no matter what type of objective description that you can give about consciousness as a process, it doesn't leave out the fact that that there is something primordial and irreducible to the consciousness. So I'm going to go mostly more focuses on the functionalist aspect. Sorry. And so, because I think the critique on the functionalism is still quite relevant. And so for Francisco, another popular way to deal with this gap is with the notion of functionalism, which somehow understand or acknowledge that there is a mental dimension. But according to Francisco, the limitation often of this framework is that even if they recognize that there is experience, there is a mental dimension, in practice, what's happened is that the notion of experience becomes forcefully, as he said, assimilated with either cognitive behavior or some form of propositional attitude or functional role. And I'm just trying to give you an example of that. So for instance, that's a study that Francisco did and was published in Nature in 1999. And in this, the virtue of this study that it's really clearly illustrate a very common way to investigate the relationship between mind and consciousness. And in this task, it was collected by a colleague of Francisco in his lab. They look at Mooney faces, which is a stimuli that when it's presented upward, you can see a face, in that case, Marilyn Monroe. But when you flip the images down, then you can't see any form, any gestalt, any faces. So in that case, the subject, when he's engaged with a task, he has to press a button. So behaviorally, you can operationalize the fact of either perceiving a face or a gestalt or not seeing the face. And what they found is that you could find a neural correlate using, particularly in the pattern of large-scale face synchrony measured by EEG, such that there is a more phase coupling in particular the gamma band when you see the face compared to when you don't see a face. So that's just a good illustration about how far it is typically used how far the subject is typically used in consciousness research. And in that case, it's particularly only focused on the content of consciousness. So of course, the subject is engaged, but I think the point of Francisco, what I understood, that it's only minimally engaged, and there is many aspects of consciousness that are left untouched with this approach, and in particular about structural aspect of consciousness. And I'm going to describe that in a second. So to come back to the functionalist as a theory. According to Francisco, one of the limitations is that often when you look at theories, and I mean, at the time it was bars, but you could use now more contemporary name, like maybe he would put Tononi's framework here or Dewey, who knows. So any kind of functionalist approach to the mind, you will say that these frameworks typically start with a modular items of cognitive capacity. And then they built a theoretical framework to put together all these different units to account for the unity of consciousness. And as he wrote, the strategy to bridge this emergent unity and experience itself varies, but it is left typically vague since the entire approach relies almost entirely on a third person or externalist approach to obtain data and to validate the theory. I think that's I think a very core point, I think, of his critiques is that even as I just mentioned before, even if you engage consciousness in this Mooney phase task, at the end it's reduced to a minimal to, for instance, just some third-person measure such as the behavior, and you don't really grab or explore what it is to be experiencing a Mooney phase and what it is to have an experience, an emotion, or certain, even you can't really understand the first-person viewpoint of what it is to be having a certain content. So for Francisco, in all functionalist accounts, what is missing is not the coherent nature of the explanation. So in a way, it's not, neurophenomenology is not, I mean, my reading of this sentence, it does not really question the fact that that we probably find a potential mechanism to understand certain aspect of consciousness. But what is questioned, it is alienation from human life. That's a very point that's quite actually hard to grasp, and that's why I think probably it's often difficult to really understand what Francisco meant by neurophenomenology, and so I'm going to try to illustrate what is at stake to keep this connection between experience and third-person data. And as he wrote, it's only putting human life back in will. Yeah, only putting human back in will erase that absence. Not some extra ingredient or profound theoretical fix. So now here it's referring to Chalmers' proposal to add an ontological ingredient to account for a non-reductionist explanation of consciousness. So Francisco refused to do that, while recognizing that consciousness is irreducible nonetheless. Okay, so let's now go into the second part of his proposal, which is the methodological remedy that he's proposing to in the neurophenomenological approach. So here I'm just going to give you some of the messages that I understood from his approach. So he explicitly tried to root his approach to continental phenomenology. And as you can recognize, maybe Edmund Husserl on the picture at the bottom, who is the father of phenomenology. And it's really connected to that tradition, because for him, one of the core contribution of Husserl was to question the so-called natural attitude, which is the tendency that we have to perceive the world, object, anything that's appear outside as be solid, existent, permanent, with a solid sense of a subject apprehending a separate object. So the whole focus of Husserl was to question the pre-existence of the world and inviting us to bracket that belief about the existence of a certain perceptual object or a certain thought and so on, and to set aside the natural attitude to be able to examine the feature of experience itself. So by which constitutive act consciousness bring forth the feeling of presence of the object. So in a nutshell, what's the core proposal of Husserl was to shift attention from being object-oriented to really capture the gesture, the mental action, one could say, by which this perception is constituted. So in more contemporary terms, this notion has been also used in relation to meditation training, and Francisco and Evan wrote the embodied mind to discuss this point, and that again that the same idea that through this specific exploration of experience, like in mindfulness meditation, you can learn more intimacy and be able to bracket sometime the way objects or appearance, what appear in the mind, it could be thoughts, perception, or emotions. And now there is a whole field of research that has, in clinical setting, has been using these techniques of practice in for instance, to treat, to help with depression or anxiety. So, the first point is question the natural attitude. And the second point is really to I think at the heart of his research is to say that, well, at the end, what he has taken as a quote is to get a systematic exploration of the only link between mind, so the experience, and consciousness, which could be thought also as a biological process that seems both obvious and natural, the structure of human experience itself. So what that really stakes in neurophenomenology is to be able to rigorously explore in a first-person manner the certain feature of experience, in particular the structure of human experience. And Francisco gave several examples in terms of, for instance, the retention of time in time consciousness, or bistable rivalry, and so on. So certain feature of experience can be described and cultivated, and this he spends then a lot of time in this article to make the point that it's that this type of insights that one could get about through mental training are not just private. They can be intersubjectively verified through and there are techniques to refine the intersubjective validity of these reports and in such a way that can be replicatable and rigorous. So the whole point that you can get at some very specific feature of experience through training, and that's required then a sustainable training, the cultivation of certain know-how, and also that's only possible through actually what you call a widening research community, so that there is actually a whole community of researchers that can become proficient not only in say neuroscience, but also in this rigorous exploration of experience. And in a nutshell, I think that's the vision of Mind and Life Europe that was central to the vision of Mind and Life Europe. Now, just a couple of more words on the. So what are the core cognitive mechanisms that are mediating this phenomenological approach in neurophenomenology? So Francisco highlighted four aspects of the method. So I just discussed the natural attitude, which is the capacity to bracket, to suspend belief, in particular the belief in the existence of what's appearing in the mind. So I just give you these quotes to explain that I found particularly useful. So natural attitude, the point is to turn the direction of the movement of thinking from its habitual content-oriented direction backward toward the arising of thoughts themselves. This is no more, no less than the very human capacity for reflexivity and the lifeblood of reduction. To engage in reduction is to cultivate a systematic capacity for reflection on the spot, thus opening new possibility within our habitual mind streams. So I think this sentence really captures what is scientifically interesting in this approach. It is to mobilize this so intrinsic capacity for an agent to become aware of one's own cognition, and that's on the spot. So I mean that you can do that while being engaged in a, say, perception or pain or whatever, and that's capacity to become aware of a certain process on the spot, give an opportunity or possibility then to really engage and bring forth to engage the agent or the subject in constraining the interpretation itself of what we're measuring at the third person level. So that's then open new possibility, which is a capacity then to scientifically explore or investigate certain process that we could not do if without this reflexivity. so that's one point. And the second point is this notion of intuition, and that's he emphasizes the role of what he called intimacy or immediate evidence. So through the reduction, there is, so just to read this sentence, this gain in intimacy with the phenomena is crucial, for it is the basis of the criteria of truth in phenomenological analysis, the nature of its evidence. So the point is that there is, through that reflexivity, you have a direct, immediate access to certain aspect of experience, what you call intimacy, and that's really the starting point of what neurophenomenology could bring forward in science. And it continued by cultivating then there is he said, it continues by a cultivation of imaginary variation, considering in the virtual space of mind multiple possibility of the phenomena as it appear. It is through this multiple variation that a new stage of understanding arises, a aha experience, which adds new evidence that carries a force of convictions. The point is that when you that there is a training procedure that could be developed to for a system to become aware, for an organism to become aware of certain invariant or certain structural feature of his mind. And it's by repeating a certain experience or exercise many times that you can stabilize the understanding of that feature. And so that's really a key aspect of the methods that Francisco proposed to use in the scientific study of consciousness. And for that, it's require stability, training, and it's a pragmatical approach to consciousness. Now, in the third part of the article, Francisco then proposed to give example about the type of what he called neurophenomenological circulation, which is a type of relationship that what could expect to find by using this framework. And he proposed this very somehow mysterious working hypothesis of neurophenomenology, which is that the phenomenological account of the structure of experience and their counterpart in cognitive science relate to each other through reciprocal constraints. So for me, it took me a lot of time just to really chew what it really meant by that. And I think there are many ways one can understand what reciprocal constraint means. And I will discuss that at the end of this presentation. But I guess based on what I just presented, I think what is at stake is the following: that what Francisco really wants to propose is, when you look at the relationship between the physiology and the phenomenology, he wants to go beyond simply what he calls analytical isomorphism, which is that when certain feature of the physiology, say a certain pattern of connectivity in the gamma range, looks like or correlate with a certain feature of phenomenology, for instance, the Mooney phase. This question, the fact that the implication that we say that therefore that physiological process explain this particular feature of phenomenology. For him, what is really at stake is a more demanding relationship that he called reciprocal and generative constraint. And I think one can really quite easily understand one aspect of the constraint. So it's quite easy to understand how the first-person data the third-person data, so the physiology, can constrain the experience. So as he discussed in some of his work on time consciousness, you could have certain candidates of a certain physiological process, a certain pattern of large-scale neural coherent behavior in the brain could account for be the emergent basis for a certain feature of a consciousness. So this part is quite straightforward, and I don't think it's really the contribution of neurophenomenology. the one where there is a contribution is the other way around, is how phenomenological can provide two things: its senses and a constraint. So the senses is simply the fact that the conscious agent can actually just give meaning to its neurophysiological counterpart, for instance. And the constraint aspect, that's where I think the tricky part. It's that somehow there is, because of the intimacy and that the subject gain with his own experience and his capacity to report a certain a structure or feature of experience, that's information somehow is going to constrain, could have explicitly the certain aspect of the physiology. So this part is really, I think, the tricky part, at least for me, and I'm going to try to explain with some of the work where I've been doing my PhD at the time, and just the whole point is just to make it more as an example. So you remember I present the Mooney faces and how it was a correlate to we could have a correlate of visual perception of a gestalt, but what is missing is somehow, if you want, all the cognitive and phenomenological background or the context of the perception. So what it meant what it is to be actually seeing a Mooney face. Maybe it's you remember something. Maybe you were distracted. Maybe there was a mind-wandering episode, and so on. So in a way, that there are the whole subjective lives that follow that is associated to a given content of this, and so somehow we could try to, what we try to do is to better understand this cognitive this context of perception, and as a tool to using the first-person approach as a way to understand the variability of the brain response and to better characterize the ongoing endogenous activity of the brain. So somehow to use this, so in a way we test this hypothesis by showing how training in this neurophenomenological approach could help reduce the opacity of brain response. In that case, it's try variability or noise. That's how we explicitly test this notion of mutual constraints, and by testing whether some specific phenomenological cluster could account for some of something that could be otherwise be just a noise. So in a nutshell, I mean, the key point is that the subject was just looking at seeing a stereogram, and a couple of seconds before he was just staring at it, and we tried to characterize the attentional context by which a person was looking at the stereogram. And so the key point here is that we try to actively engage this experiential pole in many ways. First, the participant was trained to do many times this experience to try to discover to stabilize some first-person invariant in his experience. So that was really how we tried to use this reflexivity of the mind, and to gain intimacy. The participant can gain intimacy with his own experience to isolate certain invariant in his experience. And then once that was identified, the participant did the task, and after each trial report what's happened in terms of his background and in terms of the context of his perception. And then we gather the different trial in phenomenological cluster. So for instance, after each trial, that's just an example, you could say, I felt inquisitively that the stereogram was about to be displayed. When it's appeared, I had a feeling of confirmation. I immediately answer, I was not surprised. And so you do that for like a certain number of time, and then you can gather the different cluster. And that's just one example of something we found. Just so there are different phenomenological cluster are just representing two extreme, one cluster of stable readiness and one cluster of non-readiness. And you can see that preceding the the presentation of the stereogram, you could see a neural correlate of a certain pattern of phase synchrony of our frontal electrodes that you didn't find when someone was not ready. And you also found that there's a differences in the dynamics of the brain response in the two cluster, and that was also predicting the behavior response that was different in each cluster. So just an illustration about how we try to use this neurophenomenological approach to reduce the to understand the spontaneous brain dynamics. And so to finish, I just want to mention that in my mind, while the paper from 1996 is highly cited, and I think for me the most promising paper was actually the one he wrote in 1997 called The Naturalization of Phenomenology as the Transcendence of Nature, Searching for Generative Mutual Constraint. And I really encourage you, if you have an interest in these things, to dive into this one. It's quite dense, complex. And I think Francisco was pointing at a much more ambitious version of neurophenomenology. And in a nutshell, he tried to separate between what's called a typology of mutual constraint, contrasting
It would seem we have lost the main speaker. This time the unpredictable predictables are really hitting hard. So Gabor, if I'm not mistaken, you're responsible for the in-between amusement program.
We can do it together, Sebastjan. Waiting for Antoine. I'm sure he will be back.
Yes, for sure.
And in the meantime, probably we can already collect good questions here in the room, in the chat, and also for guests watching us on YouTube may already start engaging themselves with raising good questions. And we hope that the connection is going to be reestablished on Antoine's side sooner than later. Otherwise, we will be only able to discuss this material with ourselves, not with him.
Yeah, but there are enough people who are well versed in neurophenomenology present to be able to provide many interesting responses and comments, and also perhaps critiques of this approach. So this shouldn't be too much of a concern, I'm guessing. Michelle wrote something. So good. Yeah, so maybe you can already start slowly collecting questions, and we'll wait for some time. How long should
Hello?
we? Yeah.
Listen, yeah, I'm back. Apologies, I'm calling from my phone. I had a computer issue. It's and I didn't realize that anyway, the plug was not well done, and so there's an issue of battery. So I could briefly finish my what I wanted to say with that slide, and then we can open the discussion. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So and apologies for this issue. I wanted just to make maybe 3 main points. Briefly, I was referring to the 1997 paper of Francisco Varela when he was introducing different typology of mutual constraint, and I think there was a much more ambitious program, which was to try to look at what we call a triple braid, so a triple constraint between, on the one hand, the physiology, on the second hand, the experience that I just described, and also to have a third level, which was a formal level that will describe, if you want, a mathematical description of both the first person invariant and also of the, we could also account for the third person level. So he was trying to in a nutshell to use what he proposed is a way to, sorry, I'm trying to reconnect online, to describe not only so I'm doing that way. Maybe it's going to be easier if you don't mind to reconnect to my presentation. Oh. Bon, ça marche. Bon, ça va. C'est complicated. Yeah, so I think yeah, that's one point, that there are much more ambitious proposal, which is to somehow use a formal a formal description that could be, if you want, metaphysically neutral, that could both describe a structural feature experience phenomenologically, but also its counterpart in terms of neural counterpart, for instance, and use that formalism as a bridge between these two levels. So that was a much more ambitious proposal. So we invite the young generation to look at this paper that I found very interesting. And at the end, I also wanted to briefly allude to well, that I didn't have time to present some of the recent work that in our group in Lyon, on where we try to continue this work, and in particular some study on pain on the one hand, and some that's work from Stefano Politi, Yelezon, and Usama Abdul. And also we try now to collaborate on developing a formalism that could be used also to try to look at some neurocomputational principle of neurophenomenology. And so that's also work we are conducting right now. And there is a paper which was just accepted in Neuroscience of Consciousness in this summer, like 3 weeks ago, that's try to develop this framework. And I will present it as soon as I'm connected again. Okay. So now maybe at the time it's better we can open the question if you want. And sorry for these issues.
Okay, Antoine, thank you very much. Maybe we can proceed to the questions. In the meantime, perhaps you can try to log in again into your computer.
I got some. Yeah, it's just
reestablish the connection. Also, maybe to repeat the call from the very beginning, people joining us through YouTube are warmly welcome to send their questions, and already some of the questions have been posed here in the chat room. So there's one question that I wanted to somehow start off with, but in the meantime already Matthis Trautwein. Okay, yeah. We've successfully eluded the vicious loop, auditory loop. So luckily enough, Matthis sent in his question, which is actually very similar to what I wanted to ask at the very beginning. So I would kindly ask Matthis to read this question.
Sebastjan, can you make me host again, please?
Yes, I'll send a copy and pose the question again, and Matthis will read it out loud, actually. So no worries about that.
I will voice the question. So I would be curious to hear some thoughts on the development of neurophenomenology in the past and in the future. To me, it seems that in contrast to other ideas, like, for example, embodied and active cognition, that neurophenomenology never really took off, and it's still quite in the fringe areas, I would say, of cognitive science and science of consciousness. And also, if you look at the numbers that you presented in the beginning, I think it's really few if you compare it, for example, to topics like mindfulness, which really skyrocketed, and you have thousands of papers each year now. And also Evan was already answering a little bit to that it might be because neurophenomenology is really demanding in terms of effort and so on. But I don't think that's the full picture, because I mean, you have other demanding projects in science which were realized, and there were huge amounts of resources put into cognitive science in the last decade. So yeah, I would be really curious what you think, and what we can do to, in a way, really push that forward.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and maybe I should focus on answering it, and then I will try to bring back my presentation. Well, I think, well, first of all, I think I agree with you, but also there is some good surprise also. For instance, 1 week ago, I was invited to be at a thesis in Cambridge, when someone was really trying to look at use neurophenomenology to explore in a very clever way the neural correlate of different dimensions of meditation, and they use an approach that's very close to the one I just described in our 2002 paper in PNAS, and she used a very clever techniques of using retrospective description of a meditation session, in that case with multiple dimension, phenomenological dimension, and then they use some very advanced EEG techniques, and they were able to identify that certain feature in this EEG pattern. So I think that there are some work going on, but I agree with you. It doesn't have the same traction, and I think it's a very interesting topic to understand. I mean, it's a good question to understand why. And if I can give you a personal opinion, I was just something more personal. I did a retreat this weekend. It's these days it's hard because I have 2 young children, so it's I don't go as much on retreats, but so it was a really nice retreat and on Dzogchen, and some of the instruction that I got there, I mean, I was so it was very moving to me, because I realized that it's exactly the whole point of Dzogchen is actually to understand the nature of the mind, and to really put forward to stabilize the sense of ipseity, the sense of knowing that you have, and to try to stabilize it and to recognize it in many aspects of cognition. And maybe I can use their framework that I found interesting to, maybe they will answer your question. And they have a model of consciousness it's called a 9 model of consciousness, when you're on the 5 senses, the 6th consciousness, which is really about the perception of the mind, if you want, everything related to metacognition. So how much we can be aware of our own mind. So that's the 6th consciousness, and the 7th consciousness is really about related to ego processing, so sense of I, sense of me. Then there is one which is more about mental habits, they call alaya. And then the ninth consciousness is really this, they call it pristine awareness, really when you have this capacity to go at a certain understanding of the nature of awareness, and in a way that go beyond subject-object duality. And I think once you get familiar with this practice, it's making obvious that what Francisco was trying to do is he was trying to push researcher to investigate that type of knowledge. And I think what the difficulty that it takes time to understand these techniques, and also there is this natural attitude that we all live in, that probably is blocking the whole point, that many researchers don't get the point. And it's only, I think, through practice that you can start to understand why it's meaningful. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think there is an intrinsic limitation that's come from the fact that you need to have some first-person insight about the point of the whole enterprise. And voila. And so for me, I did not manage to continue too much that works when I was in the US for different reasons, but I'm hoping to continue to do it when I'm back in Lyon.
Okay, thank you, Antoine. Now, in the meantime, Evan has also written some things in the chat, and I will actually call him to say a few words on this. But I would just, maybe throw in the common objection, which is precisely that neurophenomenology has, for the most part, been limited to theoretical speculation or philosophical speculation, but it has actually produced very little empirical work, concrete empirical work.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was talking to one person who is hailing from the neuroscientific field, and she is in general interested in active approaches and whatnot, but she said that whenever she reads papers on neurophenomenology, whenever people are trying to put forward like a prototypical experiment, or the way of doing it is the paper from 2012, which might be problematic. So maybe there are several probably dimensions and layers to this, and Evan emphasized the social aspect. So maybe he can say a few things here, because not everybody has access to the Zoom chat. So maybe a few words on that, and then Natalie would also like to chime in with some suggestions and comments, probably.
But the way, can you see my screen now or no?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Okay, now I can relax a little bit more. Okay. Yeah, that's always a little bit complicated. Okay, Natalie, sorry, Evan and Natalie.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's a couple different perspectives from which one can look at the question about the development of neurophenomenology since Francisco wrote the paper. So one is, let's call it sociological, and that's really all I was talking about in the chat. And then another is a more demanding, you could say, normative or philosophical perspective. So from the sociological perspective first, if we are thinking of neurophenomenology really in a more restricted methodological sense, where the idea is to have a different approach in the cognitive neuroscience of consciousness as it exists as a disciplinary practice today in universities and research institutes, then what we're talking about is bringing in, let's call them phenomenological methods, into an active exchange with the more familiar and constantly evolving data analysis methods. But already there, we have something that's quite demanding, because Francisco's idea for neurophenomenology was that in its fullness, it would involve not averaging over the trials of a subject and not averaging over multiple subjects, but having trial by trial reports from participants who were skilled in, let's call it, meta-awareness. And he was, of course, open to there being different kinds or ways of being skilled, some through various types of meditation practices, others being the explicitation or the microphenomenological method. He was open to, other possibilities of qualitative approaches coming out of phenomenological psychiatry and phenomenological psychology. So those methods to use to train individuals in those methods, or to find individuals who have a natural kind of spontaneous interest and aptitude for them, and then to work with them concretely in the lab, doing trial by trial analysis. This is just hugely time consuming, hugely effortful. It's very difficult. I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I have some experience working with neuroscientists on some of these things, and I'm married to a neuroscientist. So I just know that to actually affect this work in the lab takes a tremendous amount of time and resources, and it's all measured in the end by what you can generate in terms of publications and what you can get funding support for within the existing institutional structures, which generally don't support this kind of work. So it's a kind of vicious circle where, in order to justify the methods, you have to, have findings to refer to in order to get grants. But in order to get findings, you have to do this demanding work. And the sociological reality is that this is not as well supported as, say, using enactive ideas in the context of robotics. This is a very different sociological situation. You can take enactive ideas and use them to model, cellular metabolism, or to build robots, or to do simulations, and this is much more supportive. So that's one reason why, you see less development in neurophenomenology compared to, say, enactive ideas more generally. But then the second thing is that, of course, especially in the way that, Francisco thought about it, is that neurophenomenology requires a huge philosophical normative shift in understanding the relationship between consciousness seen, through lived experience itself, and consciousness seen through investigating its biology, where one isn't prioritized over the other, where we change our entire kind of conceptual framework for thinking about the relationship, which is what Francisco, I think, is gesturing towards with ideas like, mutual constraints that I think now, 20 years later, we might say are still very much in need of further, philosophical development. So it's a shift in values, to be quite succinct about it. And that shift in values is much, much more demanding, and is not something that happens overnight. And it's not something that the consciousness community in neurosciences, to be quite frank, is particularly interested in. Like, of course, you have individual researchers who are interested in it, but the community as a whole still doesn't really see it that way. They see it in terms of what Francisco in the neurophenomenology paper is calling functionalism. And so that is very much the reality that we still are in, speaking of the field in general. So that would be my perspective anyway. And I'm sure there's other points other people can make here, but this is what I would say about that question.
Antoine, would you like to comment on that, or should we first give the word to Natalie, and then you may comment on both of their comments?
Sorry, Sebastjan, did you ask me the question?
Yes. So whether you would like to comment on Evan's comment, or would you prefer to hear Natalie's reflection?
Well, I think I agree with Evan in general, but I just make a little, maybe a slight nuance. At least in my case, I think there's probably different way you can approach the question, and I agree that the ultimately what's would be nice is to do trial by trial, but in some of our work, what we've been trying to do as well is to manipulate states. So to try to get people with some training, and then they can be able to manipulate or shift between, if you want, one or two phenomenological clusters. That could be typically, for instance, with Constanza Baquedano, we've done a work on when we contrast a state of absorption or immersion, self-immersion, with a state of meta-awareness, and then we craft certain specific scales to capture that. And so it might not be as pure in a way, but I think the spirit is still here, that you're trying to get at mobilizing or engaging the person to maintain a certain state and try to stabilize a certain dimension. And so that's also something that could I think could provide some insight. Yeah. So that's one comment.
Okay.
Natalie?
Yeah, Natalie.
Yes, thank you very much, Antoine, for your presentation. It was great to refresh again, 20 years afterwards, this thrust of Francisco. So thank you very much. I caught some ideas that I had forgotten while listening to you again. So thank you very much for that. And as far as the question Matthis was asking, I agree with Evan about this, the demanding aspect of neurophenomenology. I really think it's a huge thing to do. And also the difficulty was that after Francisco's death, I think there was nobody able to combine the different competencies in one person. Science, philosophy, and also I would add a specific technique of interview that was still to be born at that moment, that was not really used in a sense as it is now the case with the explicitation interview and microphenomenology. So I think it was very difficult to find out a way to carry on except if you admitted that you had to combine different, to put together different persons with different abilities, and what was quite difficult to find out actually at the moment. So I think that's a very maybe contingent reason, but also a structural reason, I would say, for the difficulty of carrying on this program, which was a hypothesis, into a real effective work, experiential and experimental, because actually it required to have very detailed philosophical skills in phenomenology and in neuroscience and in what was to be done with the very particular and precise interviews. So I would think that's the difficulty, to combine the three of them and to have one person or a group of people who are willing to do so. And I think there was simply no such group at that moment. And I'm not sure it is now the case. I mean, we already have to find out a kind of community. Well, I tried to do it with the people in Tours and with the surprise program and cardiophenomenology, but it's very difficult, and we had some small results, but it's very difficult, I would say. And the other issue, the other problem, I would say, with neurophenomenology is the fact that as a pioneer study, it first actually had to present phenomenology and first-person method as a one and only thing, as one thing, and in fact, neurophenomenology is, as you mentioned, I quoted it, Antoine. Is relating to each other phenomenological accounts of the structure of experience on the one side, and of neurophysical counterparts. So in the very formulation of neurophenomenology, you have this idea of the structure of experience. So something that is very far from what a first-person method is, which applies to singular contents of experience. So there is a kind of gap between Husserl's phenomenology, which relies and describes structures of experience, and on the other hand, a first-person method, which is qualified to inquire about singular contents of situated experience. And I think these two levels of experience were not actually seen by Francisco when he suggested this hypothesis. And he actually, these two levels of experience was thought together or as something, one thing, only one thing. And so probably what happened with the development of first-person methods and the descriptions, not only of exploration of experience, but the descriptions, the very peculiar descriptions that were being done with explicitation interviews and microphenomenology, is that these two levels were sorted out, I would say, along the years. And that was not the case 20 years ago. So it took a lot of time to make this sorting out, I would say. And maybe now it's, well, it's possible to have a kind of differentiated, more differentiated view of how to combine these different skills, which was not the case, I would say, 20 years ago. So I would say that's also one of the difficulties of the starting project of neurophenomenology. I don't know what you think, Antoine, about that.
Yeah. And for me, at least, one aspect that there was sometimes, science is also really human history. When I presented to the mentor of my postdoc the paper that I wrote on trying to explain the notion of generative account. So it was a more philosophical paper. I mean, his answer was, it's fine, but you need to choose a philosopher or a scientist. So sometimes there are really some context when you need to make a choice, if you want us to be able to continue research. And so at least in my case, it was hard to be able to be able to stay in academia in a way by just doing, at the time, just doing neurophenomenology. But in the sense now things have changed because that's the virtue of the French system. You have a permanent position. So, it's safer to be able to do more theoretical things now. But in the US, at least, you always need to justify what you're doing in terms of applied research. So maybe that's also one sociological factor. Maybe what that also goes in another aspect of the sociological factor is to be able to that doesn't help if you do this work. And now with you regarding your point about microphenomenology and say an approach when you look more at invariant, I think I agree that that's really a difficult question. And I think there probably still some work to do, and that's probably not one way to solve these questions. And you just need to be creative, I think, in one way or the other. In that regard, there was, just to mention, I don't know if you can see my screen now.
Yes, we can.
You can see?
Yes.
Well, I don't see. Well, anyway, we will just recently conduct this study, a qualitative study, and that's, in a way, it's almost a different way also to do neurophenomenology. But I don't think it may not be qualified as neurophenomenology, but it's a study when you can do in-depth qualitative interview of the person to identify different clusters. That's what Stefano did, and from that cluster you can almost look at different. You can identify different almost personality trait, if you want, certain trait way to cope with pain in that case. That then can be guiding can help you to interpret something that are the way they behave in a task. And so it's just my point is that it's you probably have really different questions you can ask about neurophenomenology, and one is to do what Claire is really doing with the neurophenomenology with a micropheno, is to really investigate the depth of one single experience, and then you can do something more when you look more at invariant and neural correlate or correlate. So that it's two different. Yeah, you're right. There's two different strategy, but it's. I don't necessarily think that we need to choose. I mean, it's that two asking different questions.
Yes, I agree with you, but I think that Husserl's method and Husserl's phenomenology was maybe for Francisco actually more a kind of source of inspiration than a real, I don't know how to name that. He could not go very far with Husserl as such. And he actually needed something more experiential to go further. And at that point, it had not that tool, actually. I mean, he had, we worked with Pierre Vermersch on explicitation interviews, but he was not built in explicitation interviews at that moment.
Yes.
And so he had no possibility to really work with it at the moment. So I think, well, that's something that's now possible, but
you're right. So I often suspect Francisco was using phenomenology as a neutral way to talk about meditation without being too annoyed by his peers, because again, I think I saw so much similarity with what his work on the phenomenological reduction and induction. It's quite striking, actually. So I think Francisco was just using his intuition from phenomenology, from his contemplative practice, and using Husserl as a almost as a framework to as a way to describe or in a much more neutral way. I don't know if it's politically correct to say that, but it's.
Sorry to intervene. We have a bunch of questions.
Okay.
And the thing is that I would kindly ask everyone who will provide their comments to just really try to be a bit more brief, so that Antoine can then respond and provide a reflection. Andreas has his hand raised, and then I would like to ask a few questions from YouTube and from the chat, maybe on other topics as well.
Okay, thank you. I'll be quick because it's still on the same topic. And I mean, I realize also through these seminars and in this whole anniversary year how radical Francisco was. And rereading his stuff is really inspiring for my own radicality. That's, if I can put it like this, in a way I didn't know when I was his student. And I found Husserl, his use of Husserl always a little bit underwhelming, because he's with his Cartesian relations from my German philosophical side. But now I realize, or I think at least, and that's what Antoine was saying, so I leave it at that, that he was actually really after an account of the subjective experiential side of existence, and an irreducible account of this. So this was really truly something which was there. He's writing this in the opening of this paper, actually. And this is very different from even, let's say, radical neuroscientists somehow taking experiences into the boat. That's not what he wanted to do. He wanted to say that this is there and we do it and it's real, and we have to put it into the picture. And he did it in the guise of Husserl at the end of his work. But this is absolutely radical. This is totally radical. And I just wanted to stress this. And the little title of that paper, which isn't the paper from the 1997 book that Antoine you showed, the transcendence, the naturalization of phenomenology as the transcendence of nature. That puts a little bit this direction. It's It's really, really radical. And I think we can be inspired by this now, actually. It's absolutely fresh and new.
Yeah, and I didn't have time to present because there was this computer issue, but I agree. There is something quite radical, and I think he was really trying to build a scientific theory. Often there is sometimes a tendency in some of the recent work on neurophenomenology to emphasize its philosophical contribution, but I think that there was Francisco was before anything a neuroscientist were really trying to understand that question. I mean, how can we understand scientifically the nature of subjectivity? I think.
Yeah, the all-pervasiveness of subjectivity. That's how I would put it, and that's
well. If you want, I mean, yeah, maybe I had a quote, but I never know with these things whether you can quote use it. But there is really, I think, again in some of these again, you say all-pervasiveness. That's really the point. That's from the viewpoint of the reduction. You can really as a first-person direct experience of this all-pervasiveness of the mind in every experience, and I think that's really what was fascinating for him, and how you integrate that with science, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. This is a very interesting topic, and I think it's very important because many people do have these types of questions about the nature of neurophenomenology and whether it's just something that looks good on paper, but when you try to apply it, it simply doesn't work. I would kindly ask Hanne de Jaegher to ask her questions about which kind of points out a certain potential tension in some of Varela's reflections and thoughts. And maybe Hanne, you can either read it, but maybe you can also summarize certain parts because it's more on the lengthy side. So go ahead, Hanne.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Antoine. Very nice presentation. And yes, of course, this paper is so, fantastic. And but I wonder about my question is about so the underlying motivation or strong motivation is here thus for phenomenology, neurophenomenology to remain close to human experience. And my question is, does it do so if it uses some particular approach to finding experience or to pointing to experience or to accessing experience that is actually quite specific and requires all this training and so on? When we also know that, and I think it comes in Varela's work in different places, that experience is fundamentally intersubjective. And as such, we all have expertise in experience in this intersubjective sense, in how experience is modified and transformed all the time in interaction with other people. And should that remain, or is that seen clearly enough in the project of neurophenomenology?
Yeah, and thanks for the question. I wanted to add a slide on that actually, and I didn't have time to do it. Well, it's not just time. It's just like it was already too long what I said, and so I couldn't cover everything. So thanks for the question. I think that there are implications of neurophenomenology that are again pointing at what you say. There is a actually a passage where they explicitly mention that when you cultivate these phenomenological reductions, that's naturally lead to bring forth the intersubjective nature of consciousness. And I think that there are implications at several levels, including probably ethical implication. But there is explicitly a sense that that somehow this this reduction leads to this intersubjectivity. And so maybe I can give you a personal interpretation, but it's just an example more than anything too technical. But again, I mean that's if you take the example of meditation, that I'm more familiar with that framework. Often it is said that when the understanding of say a certain aspect of the mind lead naturally to change the way you relate with other, and that there is naturally impact your capacity for understanding other and to be more pro-social. So that there is I think some evidence in the literature that there is a connection between these skills of phenomenological reduction and say maybe intersubjectivity. Thanks. Yeah. And there is probably many more layers to that, but it's I think it's a big topic, and Natalie is an expert on that. So Natalie, feel free to jump in the discussion, or Evan, of course.
Well, I don't know. Just Sebastjan, tell me, because I don't want to take too much time. So.
No, I mean, if you have like a comment, if you can keep it, within reasonable bounds, it's not a problem. Or okay. There are many today. There are surprisingly many questions also on YouTube. So, and I would like to at least address some of those. So. Okay.
So just two references.
Okay.
If you go to Husserl, you have in First Philosophy, which is one of his books, something he calls intersubjective reduction. So it's very important for him as a keystone of reduction. And I know Francisco knew this book because we talked about it. So, well, that's one thing. And the other thing is also the fact that he was very much interested in this continuity between first and third person as second person approach. And that's, I mean, on Becoming Aware, we have a whole thing about this continuity between first, second, and third. So I think the intersubjective core of the research community and the process of validation was quite central, I mean, for him. So to keep it short.
Yeah, marvelous. And I think that also when we will be heading towards later papers, Hanne will also touch upon, at least briefly in her paper, on the question of intersubjectivity, and maybe we can then also expand on this particular topic, because it would seem that it has been at least somewhat underrepresented or understudied. I'm definite seeing the trajectory on which Varela was developing his ideas, that we would sooner or later end up with a more elaborate and more complex account of it from his perspective, but this never basically came to be in the full-blown sense of the term. Anyway, perhaps we
so I can just make a brief comment, and just to say that to Anne, that I've been working with several colleagues on a paper that is summarizing a meeting we had from an NSYNCON meeting, Mind and Life Europe NSYNCON meeting, and it's topic it's on meditation, hypnosis, and psychedelic, but the point is that we really try to make a big emphasis on the role of context in shaping experience, and how in many of these traditions there is really context has been probably a core ingredient of all of these states, and it has been understudied, and we try just to, I know that was a point you were trying to make, but it's critical to do it. And again, in some contemplative tradition, there is really the role of the teacher is crucial to get at that to induce or facilitate this phenomenological reduction.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, also there have been many very interesting and heated debates nowadays about the notion of mindfulness and how, for instance, if you have the traditional Theravada setting, basically mindfulness being the 7th part of the Eightfold Path and basically being an integral aspect of that path where each individual aspect co-determines the other. So you take it out, you basically change the whole practice and the notion itself. So the importance of context and the overall, say, the whole in which it is embedded. Anyway, so if we now move slightly to the more, say, methodological aspect and dimension, I'll try to combine several questions here because they seem to be basically touching upon similar questions, but from a slightly different perspective. So the first question is from someone whose nickname is the Coin 100 from YouTube. And he or she says the following: if we follow through with Varela's proposal of mutual constraints, do we not still end up with a set of correlations, albeit highly refined? So, okay, and now I'm going to add two possible divergences from this. So we have this position, which is, do we not end up with correlations? Then one of the different readings would be Francisco Varela emphasizes the importance of experience, which is the starting point of everything. If you basically do this, do you not end up in some version of experientialism, idealism, whatnot? So even though you say that you're seeking for a pragmatic solution, you are positing from the very beginning that experiences is irreducible and has to be added to the picture. So are you not, in this sense, kind of in tension with the pragmatic solution to the hard problem that he's putting forward? Isn't this already a metaphysical position? And then the third way of solving it. So basically you have the same question, but moving in different directions. Correlations, emphasis on experience, or what Michel Bitpol asked in the chat room. The expression neural emergent basis sounds like the neural processes are more basic, more fundamental than consciousness. So do we not end up then on the opposite side? So where we still kind of posit the primacy of the neurological. And he asks, isn't there a more neutral way to express this aspect of the mutual constraint? So you know approximately where this question is headed, so you can tackle it whichever way you want.
And it's a very complex and sophisticated question. And again, I mean, Evan and Natalie and whoever wants to join on this, feel free to jump. I think there are different ways to see things. So first, is it just correlation? Well, I mean, to some degree, you could say maybe yes, but possibly you could the point that you could at minima, it's correlation that would be novel in the sense that you could potentially identify a certain feature of a consciousness that you will not do it without that framework. So yes. So now the second question is it, which is more metaphysical. Are you which is there some, in a way, essentially almost, is it some form of dualism now or idealism, right?
Yes, in a sense. So aren't you, you know, if you say that, if you from the very get-go you say experience is something that cannot be doubted, you posit it as something that is the very beginning, are you not already dodging the seemingly neutral pragmatic solution that you're proposing?
And I think that question and the one from Michel are kind of the two extreme. I mean, again, it's the same. The point is, I think it's really, Francisco is really phenomenological, that you start from experience, that's the starting point, and so And I think that doesn't make any strong metaphysical statement about either the nature. You don't need to make a strong metaphysical statement about either realism or like a reductionism, or a strong statement about idealism. You just that's the starting point, and then you just try to cultivate certain experience, and then you engage with a community into trying to identify certain correlate or certain invariants, both subjective and objective, and that's what you do. And so when you do that, you don't. And again, I don't think that's making any. Yeah, again, it's just purely more an epistemological thing. That's how the way things are donated to your experience. You start by experience, and then you can try to create a first-person intersubjective invariance with a community, and you can do the same third-person invariant with about third-person measures, and you try to relate them. But then depending on you when you are and your framework, you could choose to be. I mean, then you can add metaphysics to it. But I don't think you don't necessarily. I think you can remain quite neutral, and at least it's the emphasis is really on the on try to create this mutual constraint by respecting both mode of the donation, I think. And now to come back to the notion of correlation, I think there is a more sophisticated one which could come from the power of a scientific theory. I think that's something that was really clear in the paper that I mentioned at the end, 1997, that you can, in a way, go a little bit more than a correlation, in the sense that you could probably do maybe a theoretical modeling of a certain process, which will have some predictive power. That is, in that sense, is you could get at something which is more than just a correlation. Yeah. So that's a quick answer.
Yes, it's a quick question.
I know that difficult. That people have strong opinion on these things, but
of course,
at the end, I think it's again what I really like is that you just need to. It's very pragmatic. It's really about the epistemology is that really you come from experience, just from very pragmatically, and in the same way that when you go in the streets and you answer to your colleague, or you do these things, you don't necessarily. It's very practical. That's what is. And the pragmatic of it is saying that if you train a certain way your experience, you can get at a certain feature that you would not get usually, and then you can do a science of that, because it is also something that is reliable. And so,
okay, yeah.
For me, these days I don't think you can stay away for a lot of these metaphysical questions, and maybe because I'm primarily a scientist, but
Urban would like to add something to this reflection of yours. So Urban, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I would like to pose a question to Antoine, because I think we are so lucky to have Antoine here, because he's actually hands-on person, unlike most of us. So I would like to reframe those questions that we were talking about right now in a way to ask Antoine, how would you imagine a perfect neurophenomenological result, or perhaps a perfect neurophenomenological research design, but mostly the result? How would the paper or the book or the whatever research design look like when first and third person would be ideally measured or balanced? I would like to to know how would be a pragmatical idea. Let's say the money is not an object, and the time. I think Evan's analysis was very on spot on. I have exactly the same experiences in neuro labs. But let's say the money is not an object. How would the perfect balanced neurophenomenological result look like? That would be my question.
Well, by the way, I hope these days that this meeting will be an opportunity for collaboration, because I'm trying to. I've been approached with these days. I'm quite interested by the active inference framework, and I know that Evan is not a big fan of it, but I use it as an interesting framework to. Just because I had the hope that we can find a way. So to answer your questions, what would be nice is to do something quite simple when you can be able to have first a good task that are really mobilizing a very clear first-person invariant, and that have to involve some form of reflexivity. So you have to involve this subjective awareness really actively, one way, and then that needs to impact on the task, and then you need to be able to have the right neural candidates to make a bridge. So Francisco was working on large-scale neural assembly. I mean, that's one candidate. You can just have a good something that somehow allowed you to look at an interesting correlate of consciousness. And then you need to have ideally something that will be a way to model. So ideally, if you want, so what we're trying to do right now, for instance, is to model, to have a generative model of meta-awareness. So we try to model the organism and how organism can have a internal model of his own mental actions. And so somehow, ideally, you will have a theoretical model that could allow you to make predictions. You have a neural candidate that's allow you to have reasonable neural correlates, and you have train people that can manipulate and do interesting stuff in the phenomenology. And somehow then you will try to make prediction that somehow when you can constrain each level, and that would be the ideal way. And and so that's something that it will be ambitious, but that's the point. The point is to be able to have this triple constraint.
So actually, to even in a certain sense broaden the picture and make it even more, if we can use this term, holistic, in the sense of getting these different types of data in that would be somehow structurally related.
Yeah, exactly. So you need to I mean, that's explicitly stated by Francisco in his 1997 paper. You want to create bridge. And the formalism, so the theory, or so you use a neural set assembly or a complex nonlinear system. I mean, maybe you could use active inference as a again. It doesn't matter actually. I mean, you could have multiple framework. The point that you have a framework that can account and model certain structural feature of experience. So in that case, for instance, in our recent model that we just published, and I can present later, we have an explicit model of mental action and meta-awareness. So potentially through that, you could have that could be one way to then to create bridges between certain phenomenological feature of experience that could be translated to certain parameter of the model, and that could have maybe plausible neural correlates. And then you would try to, and I think the intuition of Francisco is that the formalism are metaphysically neutral. So potentially a person could embody this structural invariance that could be verbally reported, and constrain and constrain that could be used to constrain and as a constraint as well. So I mean, all that needs to be worked out, but I guess sometimes I feel that would be the big picture, and but it's not for tomorrow, but it's
it's not for tomorrow. Yeah, well said indeed. Now I would like to combine.
But just to show you, sorry, to show you the paper I was mentioning.
Okay.
I don't know if you can see my screen. So that's
no, we can't see the screen.
So we just published it like last couple of weeks ago, and that's explicitly trying to find a language when you could actually then relate to certain feature of phenomenology could be translated as process and model, and maybe that could lead to certain predictions that we can then relate to either first-person data or physiology, and we try to apply. We're going to try to apply that framework, for instance, to study certain aspect of meditation.
Okay, so this is an ongoing thing then.
Yeah.
In process. Okay. Now I have question. Well, actually, I'm going to try to combine again 3 different questions, and they are another set of sweat-inducing questions because they touch upon precisely the neurological point, or the neurologic point of one of the neurologic points of this paper, namely the point of mutual constraints. So, Team Jesus from on YouTube asked the question. That he seems to be uncertain whether phenomenal data of highly trained research subjects can actually constrain neurophenomenological data. And Victoria asks a somewhat longer question, but the main point is similar. So it would seem that there is a certain asymmetry in even the existing research, and definitely in the most research that's being done, where there is a constraint only on the neurophysiological side, and people have difficulties imagining how exactly this constraint would work. So how would the phenomenological side constrain the neurophysiological side? How could this be achieved, and to what degree would even scientists agree to this? And then related to this is a question which basically introduces the notion of constraint and reflectively applies it to neurophenomenology itself, and asks, and this is the question: so are there any limits or restraints or constraints to the neurophenomenological approach as such? So is it because it's so difficult to establish these mutual bridges, the case that neurophenomenology is bound or destined to, or doomed, whichever way you want to see it, to not be able to address certain topics and provide good answers to them?
Okay, well, yeah. So the first question by Tim, I agree that there are. Well, yeah. So it's uncertain whether phenomenological data on highly trained. Well, maybe we need to give very specific example, and that's going to be easier. For the sake of, just because it's as a toy example, we can, let's say the task that we were doing in 2002. You do a very simple task when you are ask someone to report, to get ready to perceive a certain task. Okay. Now, if you want you can say that if you get any instructions, like let's say a certain instruction to maintain the focus of your attention on doing a task. Okay. So in a way that's a constraint, because you're requiring an agent to be mentally engaged with a task and to do it in a certain way. And as we all know, that it's not the quality of that attention may flicker, and there is some mind wandering and so on. So there's a whole literature on that, and so it makes sense how from trial to trial, you will see viability in the neurophysiological context and the way the stimulus will be perceived. So that's known, and it's nothing controversial. And so here, just as the argument is to say that when you say mutual constraint, is just to say that the experience of the subject is the subject himself as a let's say someone training some task is gonna maybe impact the way that the performance to the task, for instance, and maybe his attention will be better and so on. That's one way there is a constraint. And the second way that even if the subject, let's say, even if the subject is trying to do the task very well, it's naturally something can spontaneously arise in the mind of the participant, and in a way, that aspect is totally that's in a way you can't control. So neither the experimentalist nor the subject himself can control mind wandering, for instance. Okay. And so that's an example when the only thing you can do experimentally is just to know that's happened and to be able to report it. And so for me, that's just an example about how you have to know what's happened. I mean, otherwise you just treat it as noise, or you see that your behavior is just like, or behaviorally you can try to find a good marker, but the marker is not going to be very rich. And it's much better to be able to just to ask a person what just happened to you. And that's an example of how you have a genuine constraint, because the person can have a direct access to the experience, and in the immediacy of experience can report what just happened. And so I think that's quite natural, and there is nothing, you don't need to make any big claim. It's just like that's a good example about what it means.
Okay, good.
I don't know if, yeah.
So would anybody want to chime in on this, add something about the constraints? Yeah, because it's a
I don't know. Maybe I could just add a small thing about what we try to do with our work with cardiophenomenology, where actually the first person data or contents we gathered were interesting because what we had on the physiological level was just giving us insights about the heart rhythm, I mean, acceleration or deceleration. So the structure of the heart rhythm. Whereas when we had the first person accounts, we had specific contents about what kind of emotions were at stake. So, I mean, the acceleration of the heart rhythm could correspond to something like anxiety, but it could also correspond to something like joy. And so if we had not had the first person accounts, we were not able to sort out what kind of experiential emotion was at stake on the third person level. So it was a constraint in the sense that it gave some experiential meaning to what was a structural acceleration. So just as an example.
Okay, that's a good point. And also I think even identifying certain relevant processes, it's almost unimaginable without having any type of meaning, content, significance, orientation provided by the organism at large, or organism providing specific accounts. Yes, Andreas.
Just to underline this, what I intended with his radicality, Francisco's radicality. So that means, if I get it well, that part of the constraints of the whole picture which is happening, which is consisting of empirical measurable things like heart rate and of the experience. So part of the constraints are first person, are subjective. And that's radical in the sense that normally science thinks that they get the whole picture and they can use it, and then they go forward. And particularly in medicine, you have all the data, and then you have a treatment. But to say that, and I mean, Francisco kind of hid his this massive thing in this shy word constraint. That he just says that the subjective reality has an impact on that what we can measure, and this is irreducible. And I think this is really still a big thing. And Natalie, what you described it's to me it makes it much more concrete. So thanks. But I think it proves my suspicion of this thing being quite important, actually.
Yes. Maybe I can give you another example, and with the work we just done on pain, for instance, when you interview long-term experts, it's interesting how they really have a total different reinterpretation of the nociceptive sensation, and the meaning of it is different. One of the big differences that they tend to interpret it as a in one case novices tend to interpret nociceptive sensation as something physical, while the experts they start to give more like almost a mental interpretation of the experience, and it's and that's emphasized, and they have quite different also way to affective response to it, and it's quite complex and rich. And I guess the point is simply to say that the organism can probably reconfigure to reinterpret things in a certain way, and we just try to better capture that's kind of richness of experience, and yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now moving on to the last question. I think it's a question that's quite fitting for the of today's session. It comes from Wolfgang Lukasz, and oops, sorry. Having some technical difficulties here. Wolfgang Lukasz says the following. It seems to me that Francisco's paper challenges us not only to embrace a novel approach to scientific research on the pragmatic content level, so just how science is done with regards to certain contexts, but also to change our ways of seeing and relating to our own experience. And thus to the very activity of doing science itself. Might this dual challenge contribute to the paper not being picked up as widely by the scientific community? So we touched upon that already to a certain degree, but maybe the last part of the question is more important. Do you yourself experience such a challenge in your own scientific work? If yes, how so? So let's say that, you know, whether this is a challenge to you as a practicing scientist of quite some renown.
Sorry.
Yes?
Just because you don't mind this, yeah, the challenge of what?
So you know, there's a dual challenge, it would seem, in the paper. One is that not only does the paper is a paper a call that you know see certain contents of science differently, but also how you approach things and how you see them and how you think about them and even how you do science in general. So there's a let's say content related challenge, and also a meta challenge.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's yeah, I mean, of course it's tricky, but it's I think ultimately, to come back to one question, which was what would be a good neurophenomenological experiment. I mean, what we've done was a pilot study, but at the end, the goal is to do something that's, I think it's our job, from whoever is interested to do this work, to show that it's meaningful and can create new data. And that's so in a way, it's, of course, it's challenging, but it's but then it's just about finding increasing the standard of the research and try to make a good point about and just making the point, so that's
but Antoine,
but again, one difficulty is that that's how to say that it's it's like when you talk to someone who have never been on a mountain, for instance, and they will climb some big mountain, and you say, "Wow, that's great over there. You should go." I mean, you can describe, and they can hear you, and but they don't necessarily don't necessarily make the point, and it's very hard to describe the feeling of seeing a mountain, the freshness of the vast sky, and all that stuff. So that there is actually, yes, of course, an issue, but that's the same in many aspects in society and in many aspects of life. So, but I guess as a scientist, your job is just to be, and hopefully to find some convincing evidence to show that it's actually useful, and hopefully if that's worked, I mean, someone should find at some point a way to show that it's meaningful to engage. It's meaningful to do this type of line of work.
Okay, so just isn't there a bit of a tension or?
And so, sorry, Sebastjan, just to say one thing, I think that I mean, one way to answer this question is like when you do research on mindfulness, for instance. There are different levels of understanding the research and using it. I mean, talking about the utility of meditation. So one, you could say, well, one claim is to say that meditation could be a useful tool to study cognition. So that's one claim, and people say that, well, some people think you are that is kind of new age, and they don't. But maybe sometime you can find real interesting data. So that's one area. And then there is also the fact that, you know, you talk to a psychiatrist and who deal with patients, and who are practicing meditation, they see it's useful. So that's more practical thing. So I think, again, I guess it's a I could see how I think there's similarly in this neurophenomenological approach that there are ways to have an impact at different level.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. Yeah, makes sense. So just the question that I had was, it's very brief, but you know, you said that one of the ways of doing this type of research and making it more palatable to other scientists is by doing rigorous research, probably publishing it in, you know, reputed journals and getting good grants and whatnot. But isn't this, you know, there seems to be a bit of a tension if you do this, but at the same time proclaim that you're kind of trying to change the science or the scientific endeavor or the meta view of science. So which is it? You know, are you doing the science that you think is problematic, or are you trying to develop ways and do other type of science? Because it would seem that in the way that you're describing it, it doesn't seem that there is actually that radical change happening. You know, you're just kind of doing the regular stuff with a little bit of extra, or you know. So somebody might say this is basically doing old school stuff. So what's so radical about this? Yeah, that's the last question, Antoine. Just so you know.
Well. And again, I think I think Michel wrote a lot about these things also. It's again, I mean, the point is again the emphasis on the pragmatic aspect and on the fact that you need to have a certain intimacy with experience and to understand certain questions, and that leads you to question, for instance, the natural attitude. And if you really do that, naturally it has, and if you look at meditation, for instance, that's one way to do it, but it has naturally impact also on a certain as it is, as I say, in the clinic, for instance, it has really an impact on the way you perceive things, the way you relate to things, and the way you affectively engage with the world. Ultimately, meditation, it has nothing to do with science. It has to do with, say, dukkha, which is like existential suffering. And so naturally, maybe that's one thing you do. It has also a very practical thing. If you do it, and there is a genuine investigation of this natural attitude, that's naturally questioning certain way you relate to concept, the way you relate to, say, finding hypotheses, being holding on certain framework. I mean, that's naturally also that's another aspect of the process. But that's in a way nothing to do with the neurophenomenology. It has just to do with a pragmatic aspect of the neurophenomenology, and so that will have an impact on science in itself, naturally. Mm-hmm. But the thing is that maybe so yeah.
Well, but I think that the question, like the one that we now opened this particular can of worms, is extremely pressing. So I'm really hoping that we might get back to it in later discussions as well, precisely this question, and also in relation to meditation, for instance. I was hoping we might touch upon that today, but unfortunately there won't be enough time. So at this point, Antoine, thank you so much for both your presentation and the answers. The question and question round is always quite exhaustive.
Yeah, and it's and they are difficult questions, and and I hope there will be some follow-up discussion in person with and that collectively there will be an interest to continue this line of work.
I'm another participant I see for the end, which is lovely. Two, actually.
Okay, yeah.
So these are the main culprits for you not being able to attend the retreats, huh? What you mentioned before. Okay, so thank you all for attending. Thank you all for coming. The next session is in 2 weeks. I think the next talk will be by Michel Bitbol. It will be on the phenomenology of Shunyata paper, so you're very welcome to attend. Maybe we can address some of the topics that have been left hanging today then. Antoine, once again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you everyone for posting very interesting questions, both in the Zoom chat and in YouTube, and I apologize for not being able to ask all of them. In the meantime, I wish that you build as many productive bridges as possible in your own lives, and I'll be seeing you in 2 weeks. Nothing but best wishes. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Ciao.